Hey everyone, Danny here, and today I want to talk to you about whenever sequels to video games went backwards in terms of various things. Now, what exactly do I mean by going backwards? Well, there's a few different things. In fact, there are 4 different points that I want to bring up in this video about sequels to video games going backwards. Well, technically more like 3.5 because one of them doesn't fully apply, but it kind of does, so I want to bring it up anyway. But I'll only talk about it for a little bit. A couple of these points can also apply to things like movies and I guess also books, but I'm primarily focusing on video games today. I was originally going to make all these points into separate videos for Grumpy Old Toad, but I felt like combining them all since they all have similar themes of like sequels going backwards in certain things. But speaking of Grumpy Old Toad, I think that's a good segue into my first point. Prequels with sequel names. Now the reason this is related to Grumpy Old Toad is because I made a GOT video talking about this already, so that's partially why I'm not going to spend as long on this one, and also it's the half point thing I was talking about earlier. Now obviously I don't have a problem with prequels, I just have a problem when they have sequel names, like whenever it sounds like it's going to be the next in the story. Case in point for video games, games like Devil May Cry 3 and Red Dead Redemption 2. Those are both prequels, but you wouldn't know it by the titles. I mean, I know that DMC3 also has Dante's Awakening in the title, which can kind of have a prequel-sounding name, but in that case, why didn't they just take off the 3 and just call it Devil May Cry Dante's Awakening? Now, I'm guessing the reason they do this is just because that's the next one they made, like DMC3 was the 3rd Devil May Cry game they made, and Red Dead Redemption 2 was the 2nd Red Dead Redemption that was made. But in Rockstar's case, they didn't do that with GTA. I mean, they didn't call Vice City GTA 4 and San Andreas GTA 5. Although, ironically enough, they are very similar, but only because they take place in the same location. Anyway, they could have done what Rare did with Perfect Dark and have the prequel have, like, 0 in the title. Like, Perfect Dark 0, that's a prequel, and it sounds like a prequel. Or like in Borderlands' case, where they had the pre-sequel, just a clever way of saying it takes place between 1 and 2. Bottom line, prequels do not need to have sequel names. Just because it's the next one you make doesn't mean you have to give it that next number. Now on to my next point. Gameplay. Now, I'm sure this one's going to cause some controversy. Now, when I talk about this, I'm not going to be talking about little things like changing certain game mechanics or removing certain game mechanics for the sequels, or like simplifying something. That can kind of vary. I'm talking about direct sequels to games where the game feels completely different from the previous game in a way that feels like it's downgraded, like even games on the same console or possibly the next console up. The prime example I'll be using is when a game has full 3D gameplay and then the direct sequel has 2D gameplay. I'm just going to be blunt. Around 90-something% of the time out of the games I've seen do this, the sequel feels like a downgrade because it went 2D. Now, part of this is because I mainly prefer 3D games, but it really all depends on the game. I want to say I prefer 3D games about 55 to 60% of the time. I don't mind this as much if the next game is technically a direct sequel, but is more of a tie-in spin-off game that's more optional and not really the next main game. It's just more of a tie-in if you want to understand certain little aspects of the story. But what I'm talking about is whenever it's the next main game that goes for around the same price, or exactly the same price, but it feels like an absolute downgrade. There are quite a few DS games that are a good example of this, such as the Assassin's Creed games. Now, I understand that a majority of Assassin's Creed players probably didn't play the DS versions, but it's still a good example here. The first Assassin's Creed on the DS, it wasn't full 3D, but more like Super Mario 3D Land 3D. So it was fine. It looked pretty good and looked like it kind of took advantage of the DS's power. But Assassin's Creed 2 on the DS, it was a side-scroller. It wasn't a 2D game, it still had 3D graphics, but you know what I mean. It was 2D gameplay. This wouldn't be the last time we'd see a side-scrolling Assassin's Creed game, but considering this is a direct sequel to the previous DS game, it just looks like a downgrade. I say looks like because I haven't actually played these, but in general, it just looks and would probably feel like a downgrade. Star Wars The Force Unleashed on the DS was a fully 3D game, or almost fully 3D. It still had a fixed camera, but it was even more 3D than the first Assassin's Creed on DS. Or rather, it just had a different camera angle. But anyway, what did the sequel do? Of course, at the same price, it was a side-scroller. It still had 3D graphics, but it was a side-scroller. Now, as for The Force Unleashed 2 on PSP, well, it wasn't on PSP. Now, Crash Bandicoot and Spyro have a bit of an interesting history. See, a lot of the times, whenever there was a new Crash game, there was also a new Spyro game, either the same year or the following year. And the DS and the GBA were no different. In 2007, we got both Crash of the Titans and The Legend of Spyro the Eternal Night on almost all major platforms at the time. Of course, Spyro the Eternal Night was a sequel to The Legend of Spyro A New Beginning, which was also released on almost all major platforms at the time. I'm trying not to spend too much time on this, but the first Legend of Spyro game on the DS was a game with an isometric view, not unlike the GBA Spyro games, but the first one on the GBA was a side-scroller. And the same type of gameplay would be used in both The Eternal Night and Crash of the Titans on GBA, both of them being side-scrollers. But the DS versions of these games were completely original, fully 3D games. Crash of the Titans on the DS actually kind of feels like one of the original Crash games, just with some new mechanics like the Titans. Some people actually prefer this version. Spyro the Eternal Night on DS has an almost completely free camera, and it plays similarly to the original Spyro games, just with some more combat mechanics. There are people who prefer this version over the home console versions as well. That's partially because the home console version kind of sucks. The point is, people really seem to like these versions of the games, and some even prefer these versions of these games. So, what did the sequels to these games do on the DS? You already know. Yep, for the same prices as the great 3D games, you get, mediocre at best, side-scrollers that feel more like sequels to the GBA games than they do the DS games. Those are 4 examples on the DS that I can think of that went from 3D to 2D, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were more. Funny enough, on the 3DS, Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures was a bit of a reverse situation, where the first game had side-scrolling and the second game had mostly 3D levels. I realize that's 3DS and not DS, but hey, that's a win for Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures. One of the very few wins for that series. Now, in case you're wondering if this is exclusive to DS or portable systems in general, it is not. Yooka-Laylee had this problem. The original Yooka-Laylee was a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, so it was a fully 3D platformer collectathon. But the direct sequel, The Impossible Lair, is a spiritual successor to Donkey Kong Country, so it's a side-scroller. Now, so far, those are the only 2 games, or 3 if you include Yooka Replay as a separate game, which I don't. But basically, if the series keeps doing this where it's just going to keep copying different types of games, like if the 3rd game ends up being inspired by like Crash Bandicoot or something, or maybe from now on they're just going to be side-scrollers, it's a little weird, but it's a little more excusable. But still, the direct sequel to an open 3D collectathon platformer being a side-scroller for almost the same price, it just feels like a downgrade. Now, all that is just for downgraded sequels that are side-scrollers. Going back to the portable scene, these, well, they're not sequels per se, but they kind of still prove my point. Let's talk about the LEGO games. Now, don't worry, I won't be going over the whole history of LEGO games here. I'm just going to be talking about the portable games from like 2005 or 6 to later. Back in late 2006, we got LEGO Star Wars 2 for all major platforms, including the DS and the PSP. Both of these versions were nearly identical to the home console versions. Not that the home console versions were really all that demanding, but that's still pretty impressive for portable games, at the time at least. Obviously, they're the weaker versions of these games, especially the DS version, but again, at the time, it was pretty impressive for portable gaming. And for many years, when most LEGO games came out on DS and PSP, they played like their console counterparts for the most part. That is, until late 2013 with the release of LEGO Marvel Superheroes. The home console versions pretty much played like how LEGO Batman 2 and LEGO City Undercover played, having a bigger open hub world with levels that still played like games since LEGO Star Wars 1. But what about the portable versions, the DS, 3DS, and Vita versions of the game? Well, we didn't get the same game there. Instead, we got LEGO Marvel Superheroes Universe in Peril. So how did Universe in Peril play? It was more of a short-level, mission-based, isometric game. I can't comprehend why they did this. I know that a lot of the LEGO games at the time were getting really repetitive with how they did stuff, how it was all kind of the same game, just with different coats of paint and different properties. But this is ridiculous. This is an absolute downgrade. And the sad part is, this was the last LEGO DS game, at least one that was based on a licensed property. As for the 3DS and the Vita, they already had LEGO games on there that proved they were much more capable than this. But from late 2013 to sometime in 2014, we got like 3, 4, or 5 of these types of games on the 3DS and Vita. Thankfully, starting with games like LEGO Batman 3, we went back to the normal, somewhat repetitive type of LEGO gameplay that was much better than what we were getting. Now, with all these games I've talked about, where they've downgraded the gameplay for the sequels or the next games, I have a theory that may have already been proven years ago, whether it was true or false, but my theory is that they were probably trying to save on cost for a little while. And so that's why they downgraded, at least for the portable games. All of these changes would be more understandable and excusable if they actually had good reasons, like, oh, the previous games were a bit too complex for the systems they were coming out on, and the sequels or the next games in general were more simplified in a way for more people to enjoy it because it's a little more streamlined or something, and it just works better on the systems they came out on. But instead, these changes feel like they were just going cheaper to save on cost. To clarify, I mean for them to save cost. The customer still had to pay the same price, for the most part. Now with all that said, moving on to my next point, let's talk about age ratings. There have been quite a few video games where the age rating of the sequel is lower than that of its predecessor, like an M-rated game going to a T-rated game, or a T-rated game going to an E or E10 rated game, stuff like that. Such as the Portal games, like Portal 1 being T-rated and Portal 2 being E10 plus rated. I will go ahead and say that this doesn't always completely bother me, as you have games like Halo that have been M-rated for a long time, with the exception of a couple of spin-offs, up until Halo 5 when they started making the games T-rated. Honestly, the T rating is more of a matching rating for the Halo series anyway. And Ratchet & Clank, they've always wanted to do something like E10, but at the time they didn't have that kind of rating, so for the first 4 games they made them T-rated, but when they were all re-released they had E10 plus ratings. Plus, all games after the PS2 games had E10 plus ratings. And there are more examples like that. But going back to the tie-in spin-off game thing, whenever there's a tie-in spin-off that has a lower age rating, that's technically a sequel or sometimes a prequel, that's fine, because it's a spin-off, it's more there for you if you want to possibly extend your knowledge of the lore a little more, but it's not one of the main games. Where this actually bothers me is whenever it's a mainline game that has a lower age rating than the previous game, and then the sequel to that one, or 2 sequels later, it goes back to the one from the previous game. That's where it really bothers me. Case in point, the Dark Souls trilogy. The first game has an M rating, the second game has a T rating, and then the third game goes back to the M rating. Now, I don't know too much about Dark Souls. I've only played a little bit of the first game, so I don't know how much the stories actually connect, but I do know they're still mainline, and it's still very bothersome that, say, parents listen to the age ratings and their kid is 13, well, they're only going to get them Dark Souls 2. They're not going to understand what happened with Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3. It just feels awkward. When it comes to the mainline Sonic the Hedgehog games, which can get a little confusing about which one is mainline and which one is spin-off, but anyway, when it comes to the generally mainline games, the first few were E-rated, but with Sonic 06 it was E10, Sonic Unleashed was E10, but then Sonic Colors and Sonic, the original Sonic generations after that, had E ratings, but then Sonic Lost World had the E10 Plus rating, and it kind of bounces around, but the series also kind of bounces around with the quality of the games or the type of gameplay, so I've just come to accept that fact. Also, when it comes to Sonic, even though they are technically sequels, it doesn't really matter which game you play. It kind of feels self-contained anyway, even if they make references to the previous games. They're kind of self-contained adventures. But the one that really bothered my OCD brain, I don't actually have OCD, even more so than Dark Souls, was with the original release of Sam & Max The Devil's Playhouse on PS3. See, whenever you downloaded Telltale games on the PS3, they would separate the episodes into different games. I mean, they were the same game, but they would separate the episodes as if they were separate games. Pretty much all the Telltale games on PS3, all the episodes would have the same rating since it was the same game. Except for Sam & Max The Devil's Playhouse. Up to this point, the Sam & Max games had T ratings, at least the previous two had T ratings. But then The Devil's Playhouse was released as an E10 Plus rated game. Except for Episode 2 on PS3. That one had a T rating. Which means, going back to parents following the age ratings, little Terry Jerry of ages 10 to 12 couldn't play Episode 2 because they're not old enough. But in this single game, or supposed to be single game, they can play Episode 1, Episode 3, Episode 4, and Episode 5. And there might be an Episode 6, I can't remember for sure. But basically, they can't play the full game because of that one episode that suddenly has a rating that's too high for little Terry Jerry. Now, I realize this is something I'm probably overreacting to, and it should not bother me at all, at least not now, but knowing this fact just gets under my skin for some reason. I don't know why, it just bothers me so much with the way it was released like that. Thankfully, the remaster gave it the T rating, and it's the whole package. It's not separated into different games. It's the whole package, and that's how it should have been in the first place. But like I was saying earlier, in certain situations, this kind of stuff doesn't bother me all that much if it's a case where it's going to be this certain rating from now on, or if it's a spin-off or something. But when it comes to story-driven games that do stuff like this anyway, it is a little bit bothersome that a younger audience can play the future game, but they're not going to be able to understand stuff because they can't play the previous games because they're not old enough. It kind of bothers me in certain ways, but I mean, you know. I'm not saying that each sequel to games has to be of the same maturity as the previous game with the age rating, but it needs to be a little more consistent with what kind of series it is. Moving on to my final point of the video, hopefully I can describe this well enough. Whenever a sequel does or doesn't come to a certain game system or a family of game systems, but then the sequel to that doesn't do the same thing. Okay, I kind of failed at that, but hopefully you'll understand what I'm saying. Okay, so let's say you have a trilogy of games on a single game system or within that family of game systems. So you release the first game on one console, don't release the second one on either console, but then release the third one on the next console, but you completely skip the second one in this very story-driven game series, game trilogy. Wouldn't that just be bothersome? Wouldn't that just kind of drive you nuts? Because what I just described to you was exactly what happened with the Legend of Spyro trilogy on Xbox and Xbox 360. A New Beginning came out on the original Xbox, and Dawn of the Dragon came out on the Xbox 360. But the middle game, Eternal Night, came out on neither system. It only came out on PS2 and some Nintendo systems. So if you only play these games on Xbox, the third game is going to kind of confuse you to a certain extent about what's happening and why certain things are happening. Now, Xbox players, you didn't exactly miss out on a good game. You kind of missed out on not a very good game, to put it lightly. But story-wise, it was important. How about another story-driven franchise, Kingdom Hearts? Most of the games came out on both PlayStation and Nintendo systems, but then Kingdom Hearts 3 came out on Xbox One as well. That's a very story-driven series, not that you'd really understand it all even if you followed it all, but Xbox players were probably very confused about what was going on if they didn't look it up already. Now, they did eventually release these games on Xbox One, at least the games that were available also on PS4. But the way they release that stuff, it's just not very good, and it's kind of confusing sometimes. How about those games where the first one was released exclusively on like one system or one or two systems, but then the sequels released on everything, such as the case with The Blob and Epic Mickey? Again, those did eventually get re-released on modern systems, but at the time it was just confusing. Going back to Sonic, that was kind of all over the place. You had some that were Nintendo exclusive, and then you have some that were PlayStation and Xbox exclusive, and it's so confusing. But there have been some re-releases, and at least these games are, like I said earlier, a little self-contained in some ways. And then, of course, you have the games that were only released in like Japan or Europe or only here in America or some other country, but then the sequels were released worldwide, still as sequels. There's all kinds of examples, so I'm going to keep it simple and brief. Sonic Drift. The first game was only released in Japan, but the second game was released worldwide. And I don't think I need to bring up the Final Fantasy situation. Now, of course, like I've been saying, there have been re-releases of some of these games, but in cases like The Legend of Spyro, which have yet to have any kind of re-release, it just feels very inconsistent, and like with the age ratings, there needs to be some sort of consistency with all this. Now, I'm not saying that Xbox players who played The Legend of Spyro couldn't have just played the Eternal Night on another system that wasn't Xbox, but again, there needs to be some consistency there. There should have been some consistency, like maybe they could have released it on the original Xbox, or had some kind of XBLA version of the game on Xbox 360. I mean, something. But, as of this video, there's only 4 ways to play the Eternal Night, and none of them are on Xbox. Officially, I mean. Now, with all of that said, and all my points made for this video, I do understand that the game companies that did all this didn't do it to get under our skin, or get on our nerves, or just bother us in some way. I'm sure there were many reasons why they did what they did, and how they did it, and the time that they did it. It was probably for various budgetary and marketing reasons, as well as time restrictions, I would imagine. It just happens to be a piece of gaming history that kind of gets on my nerves whenever I think about it. But now that all that is done, I hope you all enjoyed watching, or at least listening to this video. Let me know your thoughts about what was said today, or what other things in gaming history got on your nerves, or anything like that, as long as it's at least somewhat related to this video. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe for more like this or any other types of videos on this channel, and I appreciate you for watching. Have yourself a good day or eternal night. Boy, that was really dumb.